Squash bugs are the bane of every gardener's existence. We know they're coming, we wait their arrival, and when they do arrive, we're scrambling to get our things together to get rid of them before they get out of control, because they will get out of control fast. This video is going to tell you how to prevent their arrival as much as possible and treat it when it does come, and treat it naturally. Because the thing is that harsh chemicals are really unnecessary when it comes to this specific pest. And no matter how big your squash garden is, there are things that you can do to limit their damage. So let's get into it. Hi, my name is Landon Gilfield. I'm with Pepper and Pine Garden Design, and today I'm sharing with you how I am treating the arrival of a bunch of squash bugs in my garden and how I can help prevent their onslaught in the following year. Now, I knew they were coming. I had actually seen an adult squash bug out here a couple weeks ago, so I knew they were on their way. And so I'm out here every day always looking for the adults. And if I can find them, I get them quick and feed them to the chickens. Unfortunately, they sneak in without you really even knowing it. And it's not till you see those little eggs on the underneath side of the leaf that you know they've come and they've started to do their damage. Now, the thing about squash bugs is that they overwinter in the ground. So if you've had a garden with squash bugs before, it's very likely they've overwintered in the ground where you had those squash plants. And generally they emerge around early June, mid-June, and start laying their eggs. And depending on when you're able to plant your squash plants, if your squash plants are pretty young, they can decimate those plants in no time, and you'll find yourself either having to start from scratch or just know that you're not going to be having squash that year. Now, there are some things that you can do to prevent that, and we'll get to that in a minute, but let's talk about what these bugs do to your garden and what to look for so you know who the enemy is. So squash bugs are very similar to stink bugs. They look very similar, and they both release a foul scent when squashed. Kind of a play on words there, no? But squash bugs are a little bit more elongated and a little bit flatter, bigger than your typical stink bug. And they lay these sort of amber colored eggs on the underneath side of the leaf. And I'll show you here in a second. And their life cycle is every 10 days. Once they've laid the eggs, the new squash bugs will emerge. They're called nymphs. They're this grayish, light gray little bug that have black legs on them. They generally all stay together on the underneath side of the leaf until they get older, and then they move down to the bottom of the plant where you'll find the adults around the crown of the plant towards the base, which is why it's harder to see them, because as you know with squash plants, the leaves are sprawling all over the base of the ground, and so you really have to do your work to find them at the base. And I will tell you that is what I'm planning on doing today, and I'll show you how I knew that the squash plants had already started their damage. Another thing to note about the squash bug cycle is that once they've reached that adult stage, it's really hard to control them. If you can get it under control at the sign of eggs, first off, looking every week. If you know their life cycle is 10 days, every 10 days those eggs are going to hatch, and then they're going to lay more eggs, and every 10 days you have another hatch. If you can keep that egg population under control, or even the nymph population under control, you can have a better handle on them becoming adults. Because once you have a ton of adults in here, then it gets really hard to control. Now let me show you what to look for in your garden, and then let's get into how to prevent and treat it once you do. So this is what healthy squash plants look like. Bright green, lifted off the ground. This is a good, healthy plant right here. But I'll show you what I noticed to tell me that the squash bugs had hit. If you can tell right here, you have these really lifted up squash plants, and then right here, it starts to lower. You start noticing the plants are wilting. You start noticing yellowing of the leaves, and eventually a brown crusty leaf. That is the sign that you've got squash bugs down there sucking the juice out of the leaves. Now, the difference between this and a squash vine borer damage is the entire plant will wilt, and you generally don't see this yellowing and browning of the leaves that you're seeing right here. So when you see that, you know that the adults are already here and are doing their damage. And if you haven't already been looking for the signs of the little eggs on the underneath, you know that they're already doing their work in the garden. Now this right here is the eggs that you'll see, and they're laid different ways. Sometimes they're spread out like this. Sometimes they're in smaller clumps. Let me see if I can find another closely laid together like this. Either way, if you see those little amber eggs on the underneath side of your leg, those are squash bug eggs. And these right here are hatching squash bug eggs. I don't know if you can see that, but the little green thing coming out right there, they are hatching right this moment. So let me show you what to do with that. So when I see them at this hatching stage, especially when they're this small, I'm just gonna get in there with the leaf itself and I'm just gonna squash them. The other thing you want to do if you see these eggs is you can get a butter knife and you can literally just scrape them off like that and shake them onto the ground. Any kind of beetle or predator, spiders will eat those little eggs once they're on the ground, and that's a really simple way just to scrape them off. As you can see here, this leaf is looking it doesn't have its pretty green, it's turning brown and rusty colored, which means it's starting to be affected by where the adults are doing their damage down at the bottom of the plant. I'll show you another one here. So if you see this rust coming in, this is a sign that there's something going on. I'll always check the underside of these leaves just to see if there's anything going on. But this plant is definitely taking a beating from the squash bugs. Now, once they've reached the adult stage, as I mentioned before, it's a lot harder to control the population. But what you can do is you can come out, you can search on the leaves or definitely at the base of the plant or the crown of the plant. If you find the adult squash bugs, throw them in a bucket of soapy water, just dish soap, like a teaspoon in a bucket will be fine. Throw them in there, leave them in there till they're dead, and then you can pour it out wherever. Just make sure they're dead before you pour it out. Or if you're like me, put them in a bucket and feed them to your chickens. This is one reason why I had my chickens right next to my garden, because I throw them any bugs that I find, especially caterpillars. I throw them all the caterpillars that I can find off of my brassicas. I'll throw them Japanese beetles that I find on my beans and my sunflowers. And in this case, I'm gonna go squash bug searching. And if I find any, I'm putting them in a bucket and tossing them to the chickens. So that's really the best you can do. And in my situation, I have a ton of plants and there's only so much I can do in a short amount of time. It would take me a really long time to comb through here and find all the bugs. So the best I can do is get out here, take care of many of the eggs and the nymphs that I can, and then just hope for the best. Now I could come in with a insecticide, which is not really my first option. I don't want to kill the pollinators that are over here. There are lots of pollinators in squash. They love those yellow flowers, and you need the pollinators in order to get fruit. So if you have to use some sort of insecticide, I recommend pyrethrin. It is a type of bacteria, and it will kill those nymphs, that a younger stage of the squash bugs. It will not kill the adult stage. And it can have limited effect on the eggs depending on where they are in the cycle. So the pyrethrin is really more for the nymph stage. But in my situation, when I have so many leaves, I did come out here at night yesterday or at dusk, and I did spray a lot of these leaves with that just to try to help control the situation, because I do have a lot of leaves with eggs on them. If you do decide to go the insecticide route, whether it's pyrethrin or another recommended chemical, you want to keep in mind to only spray that solution in the early morning before the pollinators arrive, or my recommendation is in the evening after the pollinators have left. You want to avoid spraying that in the flowers, because the flowers are not where the pests are currently hiding. They're hiding underneath the leaf or at the base of the plant. And that's where you want to apply that solution, is underneath the leaf or at the base of the plant, not in the flowers where the pollinators will go. And as much as possible, try to keep that solution in those areas and avoid spraying it when the pollinators are out, so you're not eliminating that really necessary population. So I highly recommend spraying those if you decide to use them in the evenings, again, when the pollinators are out, and that'll give time for that solution to dry. And then the next morning when the pollinators arrive, it should not affect them negatively. Right now I'm doing my best to scrape as many eggs off as I can, and I'm just going to have to do a little bit every day to try to keep it at bay. Now, I am fortunate enough that these plants are far enough along that they should not be too negatively affected. Squash bugs really have a detrimental effect on younger plants. These plants have been in the ground or growing since the end of April, early May. I have lots of mature fruit down here that really just needs to ripen and turn the color. So I'm hoping that these will come through. I think they will, but that doesn't mean I don't want to be out here taking measures to keep these squash bugs at bay. The other thing that you can do to help collect adult squash bugs and even the nymphs is to lay a board, a wooden plank or a board around the area where you're noticing squash bug activity. Because what will happen is at night, those bugs will go underneath the board. It's just sort of their nature. They crawl underneath that board. And the next morning, if you're out here early enough, you can turn that board over and squash any of the squash bugs that are on that board. So that's another measure you can take other than pulling them off the plants and dunking them in the water or using an insecticide, is you can put some wooden planks out here. It's going to be really difficult for me to get wooden planks in this jungle mass. I may try to put some around the exterior of this garden, but the best I can do is just traverse through here and clean out as much as I can. And on the note of cleaning out, this is sort of a preventative measure. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to clean out as much debris as I can. I've got my clippers behind me. I'm going to clip out any of the leaves that are dead, yellowing on the ground, and cleaning up dead leaves, any of that debris that those bugs may want to be hiding in. That's going to help with the population. It's going to make it easier on me to be able to get in there and see what's going on. So that's going to take me a while to get in there, but I can see where the majority of the dead leaves are right here. So I'm going to get in there with my boots and my pants on and see what I can do. Last but not least, thinking forward to the next year, try planting your squash plants if you've had a squash bug infestation in a different area. Because again, if those squash bugs are overwintering in the ground and you plant squash in the same place, well, clearly you're just asking for another infestation. So find a different place in your garden to plant those the next year. Plant other plants here that squash bugs like nasturtiums, to help ward them off or draw them away from where your squash is located. I have my zucchini clear on the other side of the garden, and so far I haven't noticed as big of a squash bug episode as I'm having here. So I'm definitely keeping eyes on that. But just crop rotation is one of the best preventative measures, as well as cleaning up any debris left from this garden at the end of the year. So what I did last year and what I'll do this year is, once I'm done with this section of the garden, I will be letting the chickens in here to do the cleanup. I'll remove as much as I can, and then I will have them get in here and take care of whatever insect population is still remaining. They will do a great job of scratching around and clearing all of that out, but definitely remove any plant debris where you've had an insect infestation or even a disease infestation. You want to remove all those leaves and plants and burn them to help prevent an even bigger infestation the next year. So that's what you can do to prevent that: crop rotation and removing the plants and debris where you've had the infestation at the end of the season. Now, if you're at the end of your growing season and you have an infestation like this, it really shouldn't affect your end product if those plants are far along. I remember going through a very successful pumpkin and squash gardener's garden last year. He had tons of pumpkins and squash, and I noticed little squash bugs and nymphs all around his plants at that time during the season, and it did not negatively impact his final harvest. Again, it's really important to keep them at bay when your squash plants are young, but you also don't want to ignore the situation if it does happen. Just do what you can to clean out what you can, and try to not stress, and just take the preventative measures you can to reduce the population next year. So with that in mind, I'm going to get in here. I'm going to clean out these dead plants, dead leaves, anything that's on the ground. I'm going to try to catch any adults that I can and feed them to the chickens, and continue to go through the leaves and scrape off eggs. And I'll just kind of repeat this process every day, doing a little bit at a time, and hopefully we'll keep the bugs at bay and have a good harvest here at the end of the season. One last thing I want to note is while squash bugs predominantly affect your squash plants, whether it's summer squash like zucchini and crookneck squash and patty pans, and your winter squash and pumpkins, they can also affect the other members of the cucurbit family, being cucumbers, watermelon, and cantaloupe. So keep that in mind. Those plants aren't immune to squash bug damage. So I will be checking my watermelon and cucumber plants, especially knowing that these bugs are here. I will be checking those plants' leaves as well to make sure that they are not bothered by what I'm experiencing over here. So that is something you want to note. They can get to those plants as well. So just keep your eyes open. I always say, have your eyes on your garden every day so that you can note changes like this. We were gone for 3 days and this all happened over 3 days time. So a lot can happen in 1 or 2 days. So you want to have your eyes on the garden. I will be creating a blog post for this and putting it in the notes. If it's not there right now, it means I haven't made it public, but it will be showing up to have all this down in written form. But for the most part, prevention, keeping your eyes on your garden and doing what you can in small amounts, especially if you have a large garden like this, is going to help to keep that population at bay. So I'm going to get in here and do some cleanup, and hopefully I will tell you how things fare on the other end of the season. So if this video has been helpful for you and knowing how to deal with squash bugs, consider subscribing. I'm trying to put out content regularly, a few videos a week as the season goes on, to address issues you may be experiencing in your garden. It is July 24th today, if you're curious where we are in the season. And as always, my name is Landon Gilfillan here at Pepper and Pine Garden Design, growing gardeners and their gardens, and I'll see you in the next video.